Hello, everyone. This is Mick Kennedy from Clef Books, and I'm so glad to have Libby Falk Jones with us again, this time for a short interview on her new collection of poetry called For Your Good Health, Drink Flowers. Thank you for being here today, Libby.
Thanks, Mick. It's been a pleasure working with you on the book, and I'm delighted to talk with you today.
So we're going to ask Libby some questions, and she has a few poems that she would like to share with us from the collection. And the first question that I think is pretty interesting is, why, Libby, did you decide to become a poet?
Hey, yes, a good question. And as I have pondered this, I've realized that it perhaps wasn't so much a decision as a discovery, maybe even of poetry discovering me. I've always been a writer and a reader, and in college and then especially in grad school, I became a real student of poetry, learning a lot about how to read poems, how the form and the language of a poem contributed to make a fairly unique meaning. And during that time, though, as widely as I was reading, poetry never seemed to me to be something that I personally might want to write. I didn't really have a lot of models for doing that. The great poets that I was studying seemed pretty removed from me, although I love their poems. I'm thinking, Shakespeare, Keats, up into the 19th century, even Emily Dickinson, still didn't seem to be working in a way or offering me the kind of opportunities that I began to find. If flash forward a few years in the 70s and 80s, as the women's movement was growing and women's studies was coming into an academic pursuit, then the door was opening to me to read contemporary women poets and to see how their experiences and perceptions were finding voice in a variety of poems. So the real culmination, I think, was my actually taking a poetry writing class in the early 1980s. And that was where I saw that I had material that I could probe. And because of my study, I did know a lot about craft. So I had a lot of options when I began writing poetry. I could get it on the page, but then I could work with the language and the form in a variety of ways to try to make poems that were satisfying to me and that also communicated to readers. And after that time, I continued writing poems through the years, and the early 2000s was another big leap forward with, again, a poetry writing class, which introduced me to some different voices that I could find with my poetry. And then moving on into the 2008, 9, 10, as I began pursuing contemplative reading and writing, that pursuit really seemed to deepen my writing of poems, regardless of the material of the poem. So I'd say it's been a journey with poetry, and one filled with surprises. And the joy is that surprise continues. I don't feel exhausted as a poet, whether it's working with material from the past or earlier drafts of poems, or making new poems, trying new things with my poetry.
You mentioned you don't feel exhausted, and that reminded me of a T.S. Eliot quote: "I've suffered too much to be a poet."
Now, wait a minute. Does he mean he suffered, because he was a poet, or?
Yes, yeah, I
Yeah,
think
that
so.
I can
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
Right. I
Uh,
can hear that. Yeah, I won't say that I mean, there are certainly challenges, and I've got lots of poems that sit there and, they've never really come to fruition, but I do see that as opportunity. When I don't have something new that I really want to work on, I can go back into those journals and files and see if there's something that now speaks to me in a way that I can really use.
So I know you have some poems. Would we like to break here for a couple that you would like to share?
Sure. I'll read 3 poems from the book, give you a sense of my material and my working with words. Calling. Again, I hear her voice when I gave her the news. We have a son. The whir of the telephone, waves whisking from Tennessee to Louisiana, a cloudless, bright Sunday afternoon in mid-October. Oh, Libby, her voice rich as ripe blackberries. We have a son. We counted him a girl before he hatched, the night nurse's fault who timed his heart rate. A son who may still talk to me when he's 13, a son who's made me a mother as I hear my mother's voice. Oh, Libby, we have a son. Blessings for my younger son. Yesterday, your father raking Japanese maple leaves in our Kentucky yard, an Indian gentleman, a stranger, stopped at our walk, blessed our garden Buddha in his own tongue, insisted that your father, the Buddha's guardian, place the statue higher near the pool. In Merton's photograph, the Buddha claims our eyes. He lies on his side, large and still, hand pillowing his head, eyes open to inner worlds. Like Merton, you've left Kentucky's woods. In a few hours, you'll bury your cell phone, squeeze your travel pillow into your carry-on, board the bus for JFK and 20 hours through air to walk with those who bless the Buddha daily. Wrap these blessings around your grandfather's cufflink in your pack. May you find wonder even as you sleep. May you not cross over the mother's edge. As you carry your grandmother's name forward, may you become again the new person she called you. Know that on the other side of your new world, your father, mother, brother watch over your spirit alongside the Buddha, now atop our rock, smiling into air. Learn to be rock. Settle. Let yourself be shaped by fire, water, roots, dust. When glaciers shift, let your core emerge. Know you are elemental. You return always to earth. Shapeshifter, solid, seek to accept. Know power in silence. Learn to be rock. I picked those poems because they explore subjects that are dear to me, my family and the natural world. And I also picked them because 2 of those 3 poems began as exercises in a poetry class and a workshop. So I think it's
That's interesting.
Yes, it's very, it's important to reach out and find those demands that can help call forth material, voice, language that you want to then continue to work with and make into a poem, a keeper poem.
I like that. A keeper poem.
Yes,
I like
yes.
that. So your first book, Above the Eastern Treetops Blue, it came out in Finishing Line Press in 2010. I think it's constructive for people to learn, if you will, about how poets actually put their books together. So could you kind of describe for us a little bit about the process of putting together that first wonderful book of yours?
Thank you. I'm glad you think it's wonderful. Yes, the 3 poems that I read are all actually from that first collection. So that should say something about how I've continued to relish that work. And I had, this was 2009, I think, when I put that manuscript together, drawing on work that I had done the past 10 or 15 years, as well as some recent pieces. I realized that I had enough work that I thought I could put a chapbook together, a chapbook of 20 to 25 pages typically. And because I had taught a January term class that year in contemplative writing, a 1-month course where the students and I worked together for a month, including traveling to the desert, to do our writing and reflecting. That was a deep experience for me and as well as for the students. And it was that experience that filled me with a sense of abundance. And that was kind of the key concept that I used in putting the collection together. In fact, that was the first working title, was Abundance. Abundance of the land, of relationship. I looked in my work for pieces that felt that sort of resonance with opening and growth. And it was a fairly eclectic collection, though. Some poems from the desert, some, more set in Kentucky, some different subjects, different tones. But I thought that that variety was also a strength. And then I had final help after the manuscript was accepted. I had the opportunity to add a couple of poems and to reorder it. And a writing student who happened to come by to visit, who was in fact not a poet, but a novelist, sat down with my manuscript, read it through, said, "I love the poems, but I think you're missing opportunities here in your structure. You could create a stronger narrative arc. May I try it?" And of course, I said, "Why not?" So he reordered the poems for me. And when I saw what he was doing, it was quite illuminating, because I had been looking more narrowly at a principle of organization, which would group common subjects, um, and even a kind of a chronological order. But what he was seeing was more a resonance of image, voice. He was looking for ways that poems from different um, subjects and periods might speak to one another. And that was a revelation to me, because as soon as I read through what he did, I saw how his structuring had allowed some pieces that otherwise could have been buried. 4 poems about my sons. Well, by the time you get to the third or fourth, the reader may be sort of saying, "Oh, yeah, another one about a son." But that wasn't what I was after, and he could see that. So I've tried to keep that as I have structured other collections. I've tried to keep that understanding. So again, it takes a village, right, to create art.
um, so your second book, I guess it was not sure how to describe it, if it was an anthology or actually how Balance of Five, your second book, how that actually came about. I think it's interesting that we have five different authors, but I'm really not sure how to describe it. Could you give us some insight on how that came together as well?
That book came out in 2015, and it was the product of a couple of years' work with four amazing women poets here in Berea, Kentucky, that I had worked with individually and in small groups through several years of exchanging poems, commenting on poems. And we began to say, look, we've got a lot of good poems. Wouldn't it be fun to put them together in some sort of book? So our initial thought was, well, it's sort of like a chapbook of, five different poets, about 20 pages of poems from each poet. So that would have been one way to do it. But because we had had such exchange around our poems and often found that our poems were influenced not just by the feedback we were getting from one another, but by the writing that other people were doing. So we set a challenge of creating a book in which there would be sections. There are 6 sections in the book, and each of those sections has poems from each of us, and they are clustered loosely around a kind of theme. So it was, again, a creative act to both select the poems, each of us selecting poems to offer to be included, and then arranging them in ways so that the poems would speak to one another. And I think a delight of that collection is that reading through, you are experiencing from page to page a genuine variety of voices. Um, so for this collection, for Your Good Health Drink Flowers, the challenge was taking my contributions to that collection and organizing those so that that section of this book has some coherence, because the ordering that they were in Balance of Five wasn't the same as a collection just of my pieces, if that makes sense. So I tried there to look at I think 14 or 15 poems there, and to think about an opening poem for the section, and then a movement through where poems were speaking to one another. I tried to apply some of the lessons I had been learning from the work with my first book. And then also, of course, by this time, I've read many collections of poetry and have tried to look at a collection and ask myself, how is that poet putting this together, and what can I learn from that? But I do think that creating a collection is another both challenge and joy, because it is not the same. It's similar to, but different from working with an individual poem. Great deal of fun. And again, it was a joy working with you and getting your input for the design of this particular collection.
So Balance of Five, who was the publisher on that?
We published that with Berea College
Okay.
Press. So yes, that's right. And we were joyful that by that time Bell Hooks had come to live in Berea, and as a writer and poet and friend, and all of us knew Belle and had worked with her, and she very kindly agreed to write the foreword to that collection. So we do really treasure that. She read our whole manuscript and wrote about our writing, lifting up a poem from each of us and thinking about the balance of 5 women's voices here and the importance of that. So very grateful for that, and having that in that collection.
So this is a standard question I have for everyone. Do you remember the first poem that you actually wrote?
I've thought about that, and of course, I guess everyone who becomes a serious writer has, some scraps of things, or 4th grade sort of poetry. But I think the way I would want to answer that is by lifting up a poem that I wrote in the early 1980s. In that first poetry writing class, my very first poem in that class, because what was coming together for me there again was a history as a student of poetry, an understanding of the power of poetry to communicate, and a realization that the material of poems could come from anything. And in fact, if possible, if you'll allow me, I'll read you that poem. It's very short and it's in this collection.
Sure.
Today at the plumbing store counter, I put on my lipstick. Around me, men, heavy jowls, hairy arms, speak of plastic parts and female ends. In the circle of my compact, my lips glare and oh.
That's great.
Thank you. So I think what the difference was, why that poem is important, was my realization in that moment of that experience. I mean, the literal moment. I remember the white compact with the little round mirror in it that I had open. And that I was at the plumbing store wasn't maybe a great surprise. I'm sure we needed some part for something in the house. Why I was putting on lipstick at the plumbing store, I have no idea. It certainly was not to impress anybody in the plumbing store. I must have been doing something afterwards. But that moment happened, and it was the image of my lips in that mirror in this context, in this very male environment, with a heightened awareness both of women and their position in society, and also the potential of a poem, that I saw that moment could be a poem. What I had to do was find a structure, a voice, to get that on the page. And so that I feel is the first real poem that I wrote as a poet, and it pleases me that it's been published a couple of times now, and it's one that I'm happy to stand by after all these years.
I really want to thank you again for spending some time with us today. I always think it's neat to get some further background on poets that we may not get to actually see read. Would you like to finish up with a couple more poems?
I would. I'd like to do 3, if that's okay. And I've chosen these from, by the way, I have to take an opportunity to show off the absolutely gorgeous design and cover that you created, with an image, my photograph of a dogwood in my yard, with some drops on it. So for your good health, drink flowers. And then on the back, 2 very generous comments on my poems from poets Letha Kendrick and Richard Taylor. So these poems that I want to read illustrate another direction that my poetry has taken, and that is the use of traditional forms. I find that the challenge of the form, of using a form that has some rules, it's a challenge, but it's also generative, a little bit like a puzzle. And the key, of course, is asking if the material for this poem is a good fit with the form. And there are 3 here in the collection that I feel like were a good fit. So I'd like to read those. Appalachian Gazelle. The ground's generosity takes in our compost and grows beauty, Rumi writes. He must have dreamed Kentucky's wild spring beauty, stands of red and yellow columbine by barbed wire fences, pale thistles dotting mustard fields, May apple umbrellas quivering in rain, the beautiful abandon of roadside morning glories, daisies winking white in morning sun. Oh, colors often at the heart of beauty. At dusk, when Owsley Lake runs red and 5 black ducks glide toward the shore, the camera captures beauty. Perhaps the form's the key. Intricacies of hosta, clematis vines, the shagbark hickory skin, the dogwood's curl, geometries of beauty. There's nature's glory, never spent, what Hopkins called the dearest freshness deep down things, a truth to live for, hidden beauty. And you, my love, who cycles by my side, who calls me love, what I have ever known with you is beauty. The second poem is a pantoum, which builds on repeated lines from stanza to stanza, and it's permissible to shift the line slightly, so you'll hear repetitions rolling through this, but they won't be exact. And we'll wind up with a line which echoes the very beginning line. Flight. I've been there once or twice, above 1,000 feet, above the fields and farms and hills of East Kentucky, where wind whirs outside the cockpit window and the plane dips its wings in homage to the land. Above the hills and farms and fields of East Kentucky, sometimes flocks of snow geese honk and clatter, dipping their wings toward land as I stand watching, my wishes drifting skyward like cumulus clouds. Sometimes I hear geese flapping and honking. How small I must seem to them, a strange sort of tree whose wishes drift skyward to weave among the clouds. In their eyes, only patterns of water, light, earth. How small and strange I must seem, a milkweed exploded, if they have eyes beyond wings' rhythms, winds whir, for the patterns, shadows beneath them. With them, I've been there, up there, more than 1,000 feet.